are free to express their opinions and personal views without fear of intimidation or harassment. So we graciously thank you all for joining us today. And by joining, we know that you acknowledge and accept the expectation that you are respectful to others in the conversation. And I just want to thank you in advance for really helping us to make this space very welcoming and inclusive for everyone who's given up their time to be here today. I will just ask one more time to make sure that everyone keeps themselves on mute from now and through the duration of the presentation, just so that everyone is able to hear what Malcolm is saying as he moves forward. We also ask that you save your questions for after the presentation. As they come to you while Malcolm is presenting, you are free to add them to the chat space. And then once we get to the question and answer component of this session, you can raise your hand and ask verbally or just leave it in the chat. And we will draw on questions both from the chat space and in the sort of virtual space here if you'd like to raise your voice. Now, if you do need them, you can turn on live captions for the presentation. If you have any trouble hearing the presentation as it's going, or even the discussion when we get to it, just click on the More option in your toolbar, and there's more specific instructions in the chat now if you need to do that. If you have any other technical issues in the meeting, if you're having trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, it could just be a connection issue. And so the first thing we always suggest is just to leave the meeting and return and see if that helps. And if not, staff are available on standby to support you. If any troubles persist, just reach out to engage@victoria.ca, and we can kind of help you troubleshoot that. And just finally, a reminder, this is part of a series of events about the future of Victoria. There have been many opportunities to date, and there will be more opportunities as we go into the summer and the rest of the spring to participate in this engagement. So we'll make note of some of the upcoming engagement events at the end of the session, and we are very hopeful for a great discussion today, but there are plenty of other opportunities to talk about the future of the city as we move forward. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Malcolm for the presentation. And as we kind of make that transition, maybe you all can just pop some ideas in the chat, the top 3 things that you love about our city. What are those 3 most crucial things that makes Victoria a really special place? And that'll hopefully get some fodder going for the discussion after the presentation. So over to you, Malcolm.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Great intro. And welcome everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today is our first of the community-themed sessions in this Let's Talk series for the City of Victoria's 10-year OCP update. With the first 2 sessions in this series, we focused on the housing theme, and we'll round out the series with a focus on the climate theme for the last 2 sessions. Of course, we'll touch a little on some of the other themes throughout this presentation, given how integrated all of these topics are, but the deep dive for today is within this community theme. So first, I'll just provide an overview of where we are in the process. In May of 2023, which is just before this timeline begins, Council approved the process to update the city's official community plan with an emphasis on providing a meaningful response to the housing crisis and climate emergency. Through the summer and fall of 2023, the city undertook technical studies, background work, and developed early directions for Council's consideration. Then on February 8th of 2023, Council considered and endorsed key directions and an emerging policy framework for the purposes of public engagement. And that's where we are now. Through this spring and summer until September, we're out discussing the draft directions with community members and collecting feedback. When engagement closes, we'll prepare a summary of what we heard and work through modifications or additions to the draft directions based on that feedback. And then it will all go back to Council for consideration. Should Council endorse the revised draft directions at that time, staff will prepare the final documents for consideration and approval in mid-2025. And at that time, the city would hold a public hearing. Before we go too much further, it's also helpful to run through what an official community plan is. The official community plan, or OCP, as we typically call it, shapes how we live, work, and play in Victoria. It's the high-level and long-term plan that provides guidance on things like where housing and businesses and parks should go, decisions that influence how we move around the city, including through infrastructure investments, and ways Victoria can respond to emerging issues and key challenges like the climate emergency. In short, it's a big deal. And this is why it's important that our plan keeps pace with our city's needs now and into the future. Victoria's current OCP was originally adopted in 2012, so it's over a decade old now, and it had a planning horizon looking out to 2040. We're facing challenges and changes that have intensified since our current OCP was adopted. And we also have new information available today that now helps us think toward a planning horizon out to 2050. It's also important to highlight an OCP is not something that a municipality spontaneously opts to undertake in whatever manner they please. The authority to create and implement an OCP is provided to municipalities by the province of BC through the Local Government Act. This act requires each municipality's policies and regulations to come into alignment with their OCP. So in this OCP update process, we're also taking the opportunity to modernize some key regulatory tools, including our zoning bylaw. It can be a little overwhelming to think about the wide variety of topics that an OCP can address. However, in Victoria, we're in a fortunate position of not starting from scratch on this. We have a solid understanding of what the community values and needs through years of public feedback, technical analysis, and current city policy. Public engagement on plans like Go Victoria, the Climate Leadership Plan, Parks and Open Spaces Master Plan, and Victoria 3.0 have all guided the process to date. And we also have the guidance from Council's more recently developed strategic plan. With such a strong foundation, this OCP update seeks to bring all these shared values and directions to life as our city grows and changes in the coming decades. So as we mentioned, Victoria, like most municipalities in BC, gets its authority through the Local Government Act of BC. Since Council's approval of this process, the province of BC has enacted several significant changes related to housing and land management, which are core topics of the OCP. We won't delve into these in great detail with this presentation, but you can learn more by visiting the province's Local Government Housing Initiatives website. We will drop a link to that page in the chat to make that easy to navigate to. One of the most relevant changes to mention, however, relates to proactive planning requirements. So this change in legislation now requires municipalities to identify 20-year housing needs, or 20 years worth of housing need, and to accommodate 20-year housing capacity in both our zoning and our OCP. And then going forward to review and update our housing needs meaning update the OCP and zoning every 5 years. The intent behind this legislation is well aligned with the OCP update process that Council originally directed, including the plan to modernize our zoning bylaw as part of the process. So to summarize, the legislation adds clarity and certainty about what Victoria and other municipalities need to do to support the ongoing housing crisis. Support the response to said crisis, I should say. Since we're not starting from scratch, we're able to build on a lot of the great ideas, shared values, and objectives that have been identified through those recent plans we were mentioning and engagement processes. And that's informed crafting of a vision statement for the OCP that looks forward to 2050. So to recap, this Vision 2050, over the next 3 decades, the City of Victoria will thoughtfully and intentionally navigate difficult trade-offs in pursuit of the following vision. The Victoria is a diverse, livable community anchored by a range of housing options, the prosperous urban core of British Columbia's capital region, and a global leader in the implementation of climate-forward urban infrastructure. As you can see, there are many big concepts that we've underlined in this statement, and we'll be discussing all of them throughout this engagement process. But today we're going to dive into those most related to the climate theme. So a key part of planning for the future of Victoria is understanding how our population is expected to change by 2050. So an updated study of projected population shows Victoria is growing faster than what was previously anticipated by the current OCP. For context, it's worth noting that population projections are rising across BC. So this reflects a trend not just in Victoria, but in the province and even Canada-wide. The shaded blue cone that you're seeing in this graph represents a range of possible scenarios, and a projected population of 142,000 people by 2050 is proposed as the goalpost for the OCP's guidance on housing need related to population growth. For context, the population of the city in the 2021 census was about 95,000, so this represents a growth rate of about 1.4% annually. That growth would result in the formation of approximately 26,600 new households between 2021 and 2050. These new households translate to housing need, and that is what the city's policies and regulations must keep up with. So ensuring housing construction keeps up with projected population growth is one important piece of housing planning, but another important piece is planning for housing need that's going unmet today. We refer to this as latent demand or pent-up demand. We can see evidence of latent demand through several factors that help us estimate the scale of this unmet need. Those factors include more young adults living at home longer, families living in homes that are too small for the size and makeup of their household, a stubbornly low rental vacancy rate, job vacancy rates, and the rate of people experiencing homelessness. So informed by these factors, we're estimating latent demand to correspond to an unmet need for roughly 8,000 more homes. Figuratively speaking, these are homes that were needed yesterday. So together with the 26,600 units of anticipated growth associated with population growth, this puts the proposed OCP goalposts for housing need by 2050 at 34,600 new homes. That works out to approximately 5,800 homes that we need to enable every 5 years. Beyond the total number of new homes needed, there's important nuances to consider around the right supply to serve populations in need. So our recent housing needs report is from 2020 and offers a few key findings that have informed the process. Over 60% of Victorians rent their homes, and nearly a quarter of them are spending more than they can afford in rent each month. Despite some progress, the increasing cost of living and a stubbornly low rental vacancy rate illustrates that secured rental housing is a priority need for Victoria. Nearly 25% of renters are in core housing need, where households have no alternatives than paying too much for housing that doesn't work well for them. And many populations, like households led by single mothers, are more likely to be in core housing need. This illustrates the need for more non-market rental housing as well. We also know that family-oriented housing, including affordable family housing, is critically needed. We've seen that only 1% of all new rental housing in Victoria has 3 or more bedrooms. So it's a real scarcity, especially within the rental space. And we also know that accessible and adaptable housing is required to support the growing number of seniors and others in the community who need homes adapted to their abilities. And while this is not explicit in our housing needs report, we know that to meet the city's objectives related to climate action, new housing must support people in the context of a changing climate and extreme weather events as well. So this is the new urban structure map being proposed as a part of this process. It's based on the technical analysis around housing need, capacity, and viability that we've discussed. And more importantly, it's guided by the city's objectives for housing and climate action, as well as new provincial requirements. So this is the map that will guide how Victoria grows in the coming decades. It supports objectives across all 3 major themes in this process that we're discussing: housing, climate, and community. So you'll see it again in the coming months as we discuss each of these themes. For that reason, I'll take a moment to highlight some of its key principles. The concept builds on Victoria's strong foundation as a regional urban core with a historic network of well-connected villages. With that foundation, it seeks to make room for an evolution of new urban form in the coming decades, one that can catch up and keep up with that housing need that we were just discussing by unlocking land supply for housing. It integrates mobility with new major nodes, including 3 new town centers, which we'll discuss a little further today. And it preserves the city's supply of industrial land while supporting other diverse employment opportunities. I won't delve into all of the details of all of these components today, but will highlight one key element, which is the general urban fabric, or the pale yellow underlying a lot of the city here. So the general urban fabric captures all residential areas of Victoria. Based on the analysis we discussed earlier, the proposed direction for this area is to enable a diverse mix of housing options. It would be permissive of ground-oriented, low and mid-rise multi-unit housing, so generally 3 up to 6 stories, wherever it's aligned with the principles of good urban design. This approach is responsive to the housing needs discussed earlier and reflective of Victoria's development pattern and context. It provides opportunity in a situation where we know we need to be opportunistic. This would mean that throughout Victoria in the coming decades, we would likely see a mix of ground-oriented infill, which plays an important role for families and attainable homeownership, and the low to mid-rise apartments that add more diverse choices, including for renters. As discussed, all of these forms are required to catch up with housing need and options that are appropriate for a range of incomes, ages, and lifestyles. It's important to recognize that because of our built-out historic context, that not all forms will work anywhere. But the OCP could provide opportunity everywhere so that in the instances they do work and can meet high standards of good urban design, the OCP does not stand in the way. Good urban design can be required and encouraged through the city's broader land management framework. through tools like the zoning bylaw, development permit area guidelines, and site servicing requirements. All of these tools are being considered, modernized, and updated in this process. These tools will help to ensure that all new forms of housing support climate, livability, and complete community objectives. As we discuss good urban design, this slide provides a snapshot of the key principles we're seeking to uphold. Things like ensuring that new development establishes positive relationships with surrounding buildings and spaces, both existing and envisioned, and that open space are designed to be high quality and welcoming for year-round gathering and celebration. And that buildings of any form are designed to respond to the human scale, engaging with the street, supporting walkability, and facilitating neighborliness. You can find the principles and explore them more on our OCP Engage page, which is engage.victoria.ca/OCP. And as we enable these building forms with high standards of good urban design, this is what the evolution of a city block could look like over time. As we welcome a diversity of housing, the land management framework will ensure developments are constructed in a way that preserves green space, particularly in the interior of the block, where much of it exists today. It'll also support the conservation of heritage assets, including through house conversions and heritage conserving infill. It'll ensure developments enhance the public realm, making room for street trees and other infrastructure in the boulevards as well. And it will guide developments to contribute to community vibrancy and livability by enabling small local businesses like corner stores and encouraging on-site amenities like green roofs. Okay, so that covers a lot of the important context that brings us to this theme that we'll focus the rest of the presentation on, community. The topics we're going to discuss under this theme are Victoria's economy and employment lands, our town centers and community villages, our parks and linear parkways, our community and cultural spaces, and our heritage and cultural identity. So to begin, hosting the region's downtown Victoria is a key employment center in the region and expected to add roughly 20 to 40,000 new jobs by 2050. So a strong local economy is an essential part of what makes Victoria such a great city, and supporting continued strength and evolution of our local economy requires intentional planning. This relates not only to ensuring there's space in the city for more offices, but also making sure that we retain our industrial lands. Industrial lands are in exceedingly high demand, showing a vacancy rate near zero. Meanwhile, the global economic landscape and working patterns are shifting, with evolving technologies and sectors, new work from home trends, and growing demand for space that serves traditional uses like processing and manufacturing in cleaner and more efficient ways. So in this evolving context, the OCP update proposes to maintain and expand the city's employment lands to support industrial intensification in the proposed urban industrial land reserve. It also supports redevelopment that increases space for diverse employment sectors and relies on shared infrastructure solutions such as district energy. Now, we'll also dive into discussing Victoria's network of centers and villages. Community villages are the hearts of Victoria's neighborhoods and typically centered around a 2 to 3 block main street. The eclectic identity of each neighborhood is most prominently visible within its village, making these places special for the community and the local economy. By unlocking land supply for more housing to be built across the general urban fabric, as we discussed, the urban structure concept proposed through this OCP update will help to take redevelopment pressure off the villages. This will help preserve the Main Street feel and existing storefronts that provide important lower rent venues for the eclectic mix of local businesses that are so cherished in Victoria's local villages. And when buildings do redevelop, guidelines will help enhance the fine-grained, people-oriented Main Street feel of these places. In addition to retaining the current mix of local businesses, as more homes locate around our centers and villages, there will be more customers, creating more opportunities for businesses to expand and start up. This is why new and expanded village boundaries are proposed as part of this OCP update, including options for new waterfront villages. So this map shows proposed boundaries for new and expanded villages and town centers. You can also find a higher resolution version of this map on the project website. So you'll notice there are 5 town centers identified on the map. They include the existing town centers in our current OCP at Hillside and Mayfair malls, as well as 3 proposed town centers, including one at Midtown on Douglas south of Mayfair Mall, around the current Humber Green Village, also in Jubilee near Royal Jubilee Hospital and Fort and Foul Bay, and Oak Bay Junction, generally around the current Stadacona Village. So town centers are major nodes outside of the downtown core. They provide a unique opportunity to advance goals for housing, employment, mobility, public spaces, and amenities. All of these town center locations are aligned with key transit priority corridors and major mobility hubs where diversity of transportation options will meet. In these areas, taller building forms will be contemplated to advance mobility objectives and meet other community needs, but there will be an emphasis on encouraging the use of low carbon materials such as mass timber for the construction of these buildings. So this brings us to a key engagement question that we want to highlight today in this community theme. Through this process, we're seeking your feedback on the proposed boundaries and designations for Victoria's network of town centers and villages. We're also asking what you feel are the top priorities for the opportunities presented as we see development in these places. This can include planning for trees and green space, public plazas, indoor amenity spaces, non-market and family housing, as well as improved mobility options. Waterfront villages are another aspect of Victoria's network of centres and villages that we're engaging on as part of this process. Through previous public engagements, we've heard that small shops like retail, rentals, coffee shops, and restaurants in select areas near Victoria's waterfront could better connect the community with the waterfront in all seasons. So this map highlights possible locations where small shops could create additional opportunities to enjoy the waterfront. And with those ideas as a starting point, we're asking for feedback through this process on whether you would like to see small shops on the waterfront and where you would most like to see these allowed. Whether it's one of the ones we've noted on the map that we just showed or an entirely different location, all feedback on this is welcome. So the discussion of centers and villages also highlights how planning our transportation system integrates with the land use framework. The planning of transit routes and especially the frequency of service along transit routes responds to the locations where jobs and housing are concentrated. So this is also true for the expansion and improvement of active transportation infrastructure and shared mobility service, like car sharing. The OCP update proposes to enable more housing density in and near mobility hubs and along transit priority corridors. This helps to strengthen the business case and rationale for more frequent and new forms of transit service. It's also helpful to explain the term mobility hubs that we're using in this process. With that, we're referring to locations where there's a convergence of multiple transportation options like public transit, cycling, and shared mobility options like car share, ride share, bike share. Town centers are key locations for major mobility hubs, but the villages also serve as mobility hubs where multiple transportation options come together. The vision for mobility hubs is to intentionally plan for a seamless integration of the multiple transportation options and improve access to walk, bike, and roll networks, accessible parking, passenger and commercial loading, and wayfinding. Public space improvements can also help to provide a welcoming transition into villages and the centers that host these hubs. So, to help us plan for the variety of users and needs that Victoria's mobility networks and hubs will serve, we're seeking input through this process on how the city and its partners can support you in choosing more sustainable transportation options more often. In addition to more places to live and work that strengthen the case for improved public transit, this could also mean more shared mobility options, improvements to the walk, bike, and roll networks, improved comfort and physical accessibility in public spaces, and improved access and support for electric vehicles. The OCP update is also presenting a key opportunity to update the vision for how our streets will continue to evolve to meet the needs of all users. So today, street design is guided by three primary street types: local, collector, and arterial. Modernizing our definitions and adding new street types can help our streets better provide for the mobility and for community amenity. So while the classification and design of our streets is often focused on traffic volumes, there's an important role for streets to be designed in relation to the places and land uses they connect with. For instance, the same street may look different in a retail village as compared with a quiet residential block. So to inform how our are defined and designed, we are seeking your feedback on what you love and what you want more of within Victoria's different types of streets. Different streets can feature different strategies for addressing pedestrian safety, green infrastructure, cycling, vehicle access, transit service, and parking. Different streets can reflect also different levels of prioritization between the various functions they serve. Linear parkways are another big move proposed through the OCP update. Planning for a linear parkway involves rethinking how we design and allocate some road space to better support community, environment, accessibility, and safety. Features of linear parkways can include rainways and stream daylighting that can help naturalize and celebrate our watersheds, pocket parks, playgrounds, or gardens, small plazas, calm and friendly streets, and a range of other experiences. We also need to weigh considerations when identifying locations for linear parkways. So these considerations can include prioritizing locations which currently have poor access or poor access to outdoor amenities and overlapping equity considerations. We also need to consider locations along existing and planned active transportation routes. Similarly, a consideration is locations where we could expand and connect to existing parks, schools, and community spaces, or where there are opportunities to enhance and celebrate the urban forest. Within village areas, we can think about pedestrianizing part of the street to create plazas that can create a focal point and enhance villages. We can also think about designing spaces to promote watershed health, celebrate our historic waterways, and mitigate flood risk. On shared lanes, naturalized spaces can slow down traffic, help rainwater soak in, and make room for activities. And also supersized street boulevards and medians present opportunities for urban parks and plazas. So with that kind of teaser on linear parkways, one of the other things to highlight that we're seeking input through this OCP update is identifying and prioritizing the most important considerations for both the features and the locations of linear parkways. Various considerations will guide identifying the locations for linear parkways and the features that may make sense in different locations. So Victoria is rich with our large and small parks, along with publicly accessible green spaces and urban plazas. As the city grows and more people live in multi-unit housing, the need for publicly accessible parks and open spaces will grow. Recognizing there are limited opportunities to purchase or repurpose private land, the OCP update proposes to help maximize the use of our existing parks and open spaces through high quality design and programming of these spaces to address the needs of a growing city. Where there are opportunities, the OCP update will direct the strategic, equitable, and innovative approaches to land acquisition. Co-location is also a key strategy to ensure the use of valuable city lands deliver on multiple social benefits all at the same time or in the same place. This means creating new community centers, daycares, or other shared amenities on the same site as or in the same building as new affordable housing. To support this approach, the OCP will continue to provide flexibility in scale and built form for non-market housing projects and use new funding tools, such as an amenity cost charge bylaw, to support amenities near or located together with new housing to help advance these multiple objectives. As mentioned earlier, the OCP update also proposes to establish updated design guidelines, and these will help ensure new buildings often include private and public amenity spaces that provide opportunities for play and social gathering. Privately owned public spaces, achieved especially as part of larger new developments, can include plazas, atriums, trails, and waterfront paths to help increase open space in more constrained parts of the city. So, as we think about Victoria's current and future parks and amenity spaces, we are seeking input through this process on how well Victoria's current parks and indoor community spaces are supporting your health and well-being, and what your highest priorities would be for new community amenities. As the population grows, we know we need to make sure that these spaces grow and evolve to meet the needs of all of our residents. Okay, Victoria's diverse arts and culture spaces include dedicated spaces for performance and production. These may be community halls or places of worship that host arts and culture. These spaces are all important parts of the city's vitality and economy. However, they can be threatened by increasing operating costs and development pressure. So the OCP update proposes strategic planning to maintain, renew, and add new spaces that meet the community's needs. City strategies such as Create Victoria Arts and Culture Strategy and the Victoria Music Strategy provide a starting point for us to understand future needs for arts and culture spaces. Victoria also has a strong history of grassroots placemaking and community-led space activation. These places, shaped and stewarded by community members, are a part of what makes Victoria such a special place to live and visit. The city supports these community efforts through grant programs such as the Mind Great Neighborhood Grant and Growing in the City, as well as through the Placemaking Toolkit. The OCP update process will consider opportunities to expand or improve on existing programs for placemaking with an emphasis on climate resilience and inclusion. It's also important to consider what heritage and community identity mean even beyond the realm of historic buildings. As Victoria plans for new growth and change, a big move of the OCP update is to re-examine the city's existing heritage program and address gaps and better represent the entirety of the community. So, thinking about aspects of Victoria's heritage and culture, we're seeking your input on how we can best expand on the elements of Victoria's identity that we celebrate together. As Victoria grows and changes, adding new buildings and public spaces, the city will have new opportunities to reflect, highlight, and celebrate our culture and identity. Okay, so thanks so much for bearing with us. That brings us to the end of highlighting this community theme. And I just want to highlight before we get into discussion that we have our climate sessions coming up in July, as well as one other session on this community theme coming up on Thursday evening. With the climate sessions, we'll cover proposed directions and key questions related to low carbon growth, low carbon mobility, low carbon communities, and Victoria's proposed blue-green network. And with that, I will turn it back over to Lauren. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Malcolm, for that great presentation. Provides lots of context and I think lots of good fodder for things that we can think about today in our discussion around these key topics of community. So as Malcolm was presenting, we started to get lots and lots of comments in the chat. I think there are a few questions sprinkled in there, but lots of just great comments. So what I think I'll do now is I'll just kick us off by speaking to some of the more general questions and comments about growth and housing, and then I will turn it over to my colleague Fred Billingham, who is a transportation planner here at the city, who can speak a little bit to some of the questions and comments that came up related to our transit and pedestrian and cycling networks. And then from there, please do feel free to raise your hand if you have specific questions that you'd like to ask to the team. And other than that, I will keep going through kind of the chat and trying to one by one go down some of the more specific questions and kind of non-comments and see if we can help address that. And also just love to hear any more ideas from you on some of those key engagement questions that Malcolm highlighted through the presentation. So I'll maybe just first start off at a high level. I noticed there was a question in the chat asking about general growth distribution across the region, the Greater Victoria region. So I think to start off by answering that question, it's important to remember that there's a big difference between projections and targets when we're talking about growth. So projections are kind of the statistics that demographers come up with based on trends from the past and some influences that we can anticipate in the future. So when we talk about a projection, it's not the city or the region trying to target anything one way or the other. It's just a realization of what we anticipate will be coming. And with that knowledge, how we can kind of best plan for it to meet objectives through targets. So for the Greater Victoria region, I think our latest projections are that the whole region will grow by, I think, close to 500,000 now. Our last regional growth strategy update was a little bit less than that, but I know BC Stats has updated their projection since, and so all municipalities are projected to grow a little bit more. The fastest growing areas in the region will continue to be on the West Shore. So right now, the regional growth strategy recognizes that the West Shore's population between 2018 and 2038 will increase by over 50%. So that's kind of the area of the region that's going to see the fastest pace of growth. And then the Saanich Peninsula and Core, which is what Victoria is a part of, will see around 13 or 14% each. And so we will grow in kind of lockstep with the region. We are projecting that. That's just something that we need to kind of plan for and anticipate and work towards. But we as a region or as a municipality haven't set targets for how that growth should be distributed across the region, except for the fact that we do want to target a certain percentage of growth. And I believe it's 45%. I can double check and look that up in the growth strategy, to areas that are walkable communities, to the centers that enable people to live kind of a low carbon lifestyle and access the goods and services that they need easily at a daily basis, and access the employment opportunities that are in those urban sort of hubs and complete communities across the region. And so that's the one thing that we do target in terms of distributing growth. And that is irrelevant of which municipality it's in, as long as it's a walkable community. That's what our broader regional growth strategy is trying to achieve. And so we here in Victoria, similarly, to help the city and the region reach those targets, is we try to accommodate growth, close to our downtown core. That's the densest part of our community. That's where the most jobs in the region are. That's where all of the cultural activity is, plenty of services and amenities. And of course, access to amenities like Beacon Hill Park and our waterfront and the Inner Harbor and places that connect us outside of the region too. And so that's our biggest hub. And then we also identify hubs along our frequent transit network so that people can have that access to low carbon mobility options within our city and be connected to the broader region. And the broader region can be connected to the assets that Victoria holds. There was also another question in the chat about non-market housing, and our senior social planner, Tanis, on the call answered that briefly in the chat. And I'll just add to Tanis's comment there that I think it's important to remember that the City of Victoria, we are not a housing corporation. So we're not in the business of building housing. So that's kind of where our limits stop. The thing that we can do is we can use the tools and mechanisms at our disposal to enable and encourage the right types of supply. And so Tanis mentioned the Victoria Housing Reserve Fund, which enables more non-market development in the city. It's not a huge fund, but it's I think a substantial fund for many developers, non-market developers, to kind of get over that hurdle and get a project realized. We also have our inclusionary housing and community amenity policy. So when a private developer comes in to build market housing, we require a certain percentage based on the size of the development to include either units or to give more money to the Housing Reserve Fund. And a really important thing that we can do at the city is just make space for it. Like all rental housing, non-market rental housing really works best in those low to mid-rise density forms. So typically around 6 stories. That's true for the market developers. It's also true for the non-market developers. So what we as a city can do is identify locations where that works best. And enables those non-market developers to come in and help. I also saw some comments in the chat about the right supply of housing, and I think this is crucially important and a big part of our OCP today. We absolutely need more housing for families, as Malcolm identified in his presentation. So I believe in the coming weeks, maybe even this week, we will have a policy going forward for council to consider around family housing. And that would require that new multi-unit buildings have a certain percentage of family-oriented units, so units with 2 and 3 bedrooms. And that's something that we want to get on the ground quickly and to encourage any development that comes online to have more family housing in it. And as we go through and develop this OCP, we want to explore more opportunities to bring a more family-friendly city to Victoria. So that includes the types of units that are in multi-unit buildings, but other amenities, ways that we design our buildings to be family friendly, and really the ways that we design our city. I saw lots of comments related to ensuring park space and slow streets and safe streets for kids, for this to be a family oriented city. And so that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to explore in these discussions today. So those were just a few of the big sort of key comments I picked up on in the chat related to growth and housing. And since I'm not seeing any hands pop up, I might turn it over to Fred to speak to some. Oh, one question here from Stacy. So let's hear from Stacy, and then I'll flip it over to Fred to talk to some of the transportation comments that came up.
Okay, hi there. Sorry, just to reflect on your comment about encouraging more family-friendly apartment units. Has there been any discussion about limiting the number of bachelor units or small one bedrooms, or limiting the or having a minimum square footage size for units to make them livable? Because the things that I'm seeing on the market that are like 400, 450 square feet for a junior one bedroom, like the bedroom's not even a real bedroom, it just has sliding doors to separate the living room, like this, that's not livable for people long term.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so by nature of requiring that a certain percentage of units be 2, 3 bedrooms or more, that either limits the rest of the units in the bedroom to not to any other alternative that there might be. Or it requires the developer to put more units on the site, which is a factor of the kind of building envelope and the ways that we limit that. So the height, the density, the setbacks. Rather than kind of taking the negative approach of restricting certain types of units, what we're doing is taking the positive approach, is just requiring the types of units that we want to see. To the question about minimum square footage, depending on the number of bedrooms that are in the unit, I'd have to get back to you and take a look at what our housing team has done or proposed to date. But I do know that we are considering advisory design guidelines for the way that a unit is designed and laid out to be functional and livable for families. We have limited controls as a city of what we can regulate at what happens inside the building, but we can encourage developers to ensure that layout works well for us through these advisory design guidelines. That's a great comment I see from Linda, that some people do want the smaller units. And so it's all housing types are needed. Okay, so with that, maybe I'll flip it over to Fred to speak a little bit to some of the transportation questions and comments that popped up in the chat.
Hi. Yeah, I was reading the questions and comments that came in, and I kind of saw there was two main focuses. Really, one was the transit, and the other was kind of road safety, particularly for pedestrians. So I thought, yeah, to address those two. So in terms of transit, obviously the routes are decided by BC Transit, where the kind of connections going, including obviously the intra-regional connections up to the peninsula towards the ferries and airport. And from the city's point of view, we can support that by providing space for transit within the right of way and improving facilities to encourage higher user numbers and better user comfort within the city. BC Transit spoke to council last month with an update about the rapid bus line out to the West Shore, and we kind of got started on a plan that's going to include putting in some bus only lanes through Douglas Street, or extending them south through the city, and those will be used primarily as part of phase one, which is the route out to the West Shore. And then phase two of BC Transit's rapid bus program is for a peninsula connection, which was going to run up to the ferries. I was just trying to find on their map. They haven't really got a detailed map yet, but it's difficult to see if it's actually going to make a connection to the airport as well. But that's something that, yes, is obviously, makes a lot of sense on a regional level. There was another comment about kind of connecting up some of the neighborhood villages or town centers with alternative kind of transit modes, like a light rail or a tram. Again, that decision is kind of made by BC Transit, and they've told us that it's essentially based on ridership and rider numbers. So again, from the city, what we can do and through the OCP is focus that housing and employment density in these urban town centers and downtown, and then that kind of creates that increased ridership, as it is more, can be more convenient for people to be going from these nodes from one to the other. The second piece to talk about was the kind of the road safety. Again, so safety, particularly pedestrian safety, is one of the key priorities in Go Victoria, the city's sustainable mobility strategy, and is also highlighted in the existing OCP, and is something we kind of like do hold as a priority. We, as a city, we can make crosswalks as safe as possible, or make them more visible. Over the last 4, 5, 6 years, I know that we've been increasing the number of crosswalks, the distribution of them, so there's shorter gaps between them. Again, as part of the OCP, with these more defined town centres and urban villages, that then has a knock-on that we would look for more mid-block connections in these areas. Again, reducing the amount of distance a person might have to walk to cross the street, and therefore, make things like crossing, without a crosswalk less likely. And we've also, upgraded a lot of crosswalks to make them more visible by adding what we call RRFBs, or rapid rectangular flashing beacons, the pedestrian controlled lights. And in other places, then adding leading pedestrian intervals, so that you might have seen that particularly downtown. And in some of our neighborhoods, again, the priority's been on the rollout around schools, where when a pedestrian presses the button at an intersection, they get a little 5-10 second lead time for them to get across before vehicles can move. So there's less of that chance of an impact of a right turning vehicle, for instance, or a left turning vehicle kind of chasing someone across almost. Other elements that we unfortunately don't control are things like red light cameras, because I think someone noted an informal survey about kind of compliance with stop signs, and assuming cameras are this red lights are a similar kind of issue. Unfortunately, that's something we get a lot of questions about, but the city doesn't have the control of red light cameras. They're actually installed by ICBC, and they choose the locations. I think there's only actually one in the CRD. So it's something that, again, as a city, we can kind of lean on ICBC when we work with them about advocating for more of these, where we're seeing where we're seeing kind of safety concerns. But yeah, in terms of the OCP itself, then it's just a case of making sure that safety for all road users is at the forefront of our minds, and making sure that we continue to kind of look at everything from a transportation point of view with through that safety lens.
Great. Thanks so much, Fred. Might give a moment or two just to see if anybody's got a hand to raise, and then I can flip through some other questions in the chat. I can quickly confirm that the CRD's population projection report that they used to update the regional growth strategy a couple years ago showed that the region, the whole region of the whole Capital Regional District by 2038 was projected to reach 493,975 people, which of course is a much too detailed figure for projection. So I think it's safe to say somewhere around 490,000 is what they were projecting at the time. In 2019, the region was 412,000 people about. Okay, so seeing no hands, I did see a few. Oh, Stacy, thanks for chiming in again.
Sorry. Okay, so the transit hubs, something I'm noticing when I go about town, I have an e-scooter and there's nowhere to charge it. So has there been any thought about including charging stations for small personal electric vehicles in your transit plan?
Yeah, so we're currently kind of discussing what a mobility hub may look like in Victoria. We've kind of reviewed them in different municipalities, different cities across North America, seen what works at existing ones, and then how that kind of relates to Victoria. And yeah, one of the key elements that I think is going to go into that is going to be secure bike and micromobility parking. So somewhere you can lock it up, safe, leave it there all day, and it makes sense if we have that facility to have charging outlets available to do that. So yeah, you can. We always talk about that first mile, last mile problem of basically extending the catchment area of a transit route, and one of those is by, instead of it being a making it a 30-minute walk, make it a 10-minute scooter or bike ride, and then having somewhere that you're confident you can leave your scooter there all day while you're at work and then return to it and still be there. So yeah, that's definitely one of those key elements is secure bike parking, scooter parking with charging facilities. Ideally, we would have some kind of, potentially some kind of bike share, scooter share scheme as well, like you have in different cities. And those kind of stations would also be at a mobility hub. Lots of different other elements as well, like enhanced waiting facilities. Yeah, see, there's a comment about the bike valet. It might even be something like that where we extend that out to a different location in downtown. So again, widen that catchment area. So yeah, that is definitely something that is top of our mind when considering what a mobility hub would look like.
Okay. So I'm seeing no other hands going up, and lots of good comments coming in through the chat. Just to maybe stay on the subject of transportation, we do have a specific question. What are the city's thoughts on reopening the Island Rail Corridor with a potential terminal/hub at the current BMW garage? I don't know, Fred, if you're familiar with the latest on the Island Rail Corridor, or if we can get back to someone on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the latest is of the city's position. I know it kind of came up as part of the Bayview Place redevelopment, and I think essentially it's to keep that corridor open and available. Again, the rail corridor wouldn't be something the city would have any direct control about it. So I think the extent of our support would be to keep it be able to facilitate it. I'm not aware of any specific position, but again, we're generally very supportive of alternative travel modes that reduce reliance on private vehicles and reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases within the city. But yeah, I can try and find out and see if we have a recent position and status.
Thanks, Fred. So I was seeing lots of sort of questions and comments in the chat about our park space, our green spaces, our environmental assets throughout the city. So maybe I can speak to some of those questions and comments briefly and see if there's any follow-ups around those. So I think there was a specific question in the chat about basically how the city plans to invest in park space and sort of an enhanced green space as we grow. I think this is a really crucially important question because, of course, a focus of this OCP update is housing and ensure that we're sort of creating equity in our housing system. But right next to that, just alongside that, equal to that, is how we're going to address climate change as our population grows and we kind of evolve and need to adapt. And so this has been very top of mind for the city. So I think the good news, and the first thing that I'll speak to, is that the province recently introduced a new tool called an amenity cost charge bylaw. So today we have development cost charge bylaws, which allows us as a city to charge new development to help pay for the impact that they have on our hard infrastructure. And that does include our ability to charge for certain components of park space that we need. And so as we think about updating that bylaw and how we are going to grow and be accommodating that housing, we can in part charge development that will impact the need for those assets as we grow. And then the amenity cost charge bylaw is a very similar tool that we now have at our disposal to realize other community amenities and spaces. And here in Victoria, we know since we're a built-out city and our land base is very constrained, and we have to be pretty much opportunistic with all that we're trying to achieve as a city, that we're going to be co-locating a lot of stuff. So as we build new housing, we'll try to also, wherever we can, bring in community spaces, community centers, other amenities that the population needs to support that. We kind of call that community infrastructure, really. And we also know that as we kind of evolve, as Malcolm sort of spoke to in the presentation, we're going to have to think about our own public lands as well, and how those can serve our various needs. And so this is the big idea of linear parkways. I think it's close to 30% of our city's land base is in that public right of way, and we can be using it a lot better to meet all of our objectives. And so when we think about linear parkways, we can think of these as assets for public space for people to use, again, for kids who might be living in multi-unit buildings to have a safe and close space to play. We can also think about it as places to really go big on green infrastructure and ensure that we are getting that urban forest that we know we need to mitigate urban heat island effect, that we're getting infrastructure that mimics nature in a better way, so that we can manage better and sort of more holistically the storm surges and extreme rain events that we have. And so those are big opportunities for us to do all of that kind of in the space that we have. And when it comes to planning for our parks, you know, the city just invested in a big acquisition in downtown, recognizing the longstanding need for that community to have a new park space. And so, you know, we're excited to get that park going. But we also know that as we look to the future, we're going to have to think pretty hard about how we use the parks that we have better to meet these multiple objectives. We know that parks serve social and community connection need, but they also serve really important environmental functions. And so some of our parks might be more appropriate to be an area where we daylight a stream, or where we bring in some of our lost ecological heritage back to the city. Or some parks might be more appropriate to be, you know, really well programmed, really lively, really social spaces for kind of interactive and boisterous connection. And we're going to have to navigate all of those things to happen in the space that we have today. I think those were kind of the big questions that I picked up on and comments around parks. Maybe I'll give a little bit of a pause there to see if any other staff have anything to add, or if it spurred any questions or comments or ideas from the group. I see some good comments coming up here about the preservation of farmland and the ability to grow our own food. I think that's a great point, and I think that takes us back to the regional perspective again. We here in BC have been really, really fortunate for many years to have benefited from the agricultural land reserve, and we've focused a lot of our growth to urban areas, so that really important agricultural and natural space within our regions, not just the Victoria region, but regions across BC, has been protected for those ecological functions and also for food growing purposes. Okay, I see a question here about unlocking land supply. So I can speak to that. So what we say when we use a term like unlocking land supply, today, the vast majority of our city is zoned for low scale residential development. So we recently passed our Missing Middle Housing Initiative, which began to unlock some of that supply. So before we passed the Missing Middle Housing Initiative, if a house was torn down, the only as of right entitlement that most property owners had was to redevelop a new single family home. And, you know, that is part of what our housing market needs, is opportunities for home ownership. But we also know that in Victoria, a brand new single family home built to the size that they're typically built to today will be vastly unaffordable for the majority of the population. And so we know that we needed to enable people who wanted to build at higher densities where more attainable opportunities for ownership could come online. So that was sort of a first step in unlocking our land supply, just enabling that as of right to get those opportunities out there wherever they came up, wherever property owner or developer would want that to happen. But we know that that's not going to be enough. We know that even though we kind of unlocked that sort of next level of opportunity, we know that the number of units that would be achieved through that ground-oriented missing middle form won't be enough to both catch up and keep up with some of that need that Malcolm presented earlier in the presentation. We know we need to provide more opportunities for low-rise and mid-rise apartment buildings as well. And so that's really what we mean by unlocking land supply. Yeah, Bob, I see your hand up.
Yes, two questions. One, and I'm sorry to be obtuse about this, but I am a little confused about the population increase. We're currently around 475,000 in the CRD. Did I understand it that we are going to increase our population by 500,000 in the next 25 years to around a million on the south end of Vancouver Island? Is that do I understand that correctly?
So no, yes, and I was trying to in between my conversation reply to your question there in the chat. So no, so as of right now, the projections that are in the regional growth strategy show that as of 2019, there were around 412,000 people in the region. And what they have projected by 2038, and that's just what we kind of have on file now, is 493,000. So that represents about 20% growth. So it's not growth of 500,000. It's growth to
my second question for you is, all of the R-zoned area in Victoria is still zoned single family. Why has it taken so long to have any discussion about rechanging the R zoning from single or multifamily? Because that theoretically would have 5 years ago, or even today, if it was being seriously discussed, would allow a lot of multifamily units without having to go to 6-story units through the traditional neighborhoods. And I'm concerned about the 6-story units because it's an unnuanced proposal in that what might work in my neighborhood, because I live lucky enough to live in an older neighborhood with lots of the big old 3-story conversions in it. You built 4 stories in my neighborhood, it wouldn't be frightfully out of proportion. But if you go down the hill to Warren Gardens area and build 4 or 6-story units, they are atrociously out of proportion to the housing stock there. And there seems to be no discussion about nuance. I did hear Malcolm earlier say something briefly to the effect, where appropriate, in his presentation. And I'd really like to know more about how this appropriateness is going to work, because it doesn't seem to be being discussed in any form so far in a couple of these missing middle, or not only the missing middle, but the OCP amendments. So 2 questions: where's that zoning going, and what is appropriate, and how is that going to be dealt with?
Yeah, great questions. Maybe I can kick us off and then flip it over to Malcolm. So I can first clarify the nature of what our kind of single family zoning is. So we did pass the Missing Middle Housing Initiative. And so while properties retained a lot of their R zoning, which is sort of single family, allowed for suite, kind of that form of development, there was a regulation that applied to those zones, and Malcolm can clarify this because he was the expert in that world at the time, that allowed for a greater number of units to be realized on those properties, despite the fact that they held that single family zoning. So those are properties, Malcolm can list off the 4 main ones that there are, all do have that regulation that allows for missing middle housing for houseplexes and corner townhouses to achieve those higher units. before I get to what we're thinking about for the future, maybe I'll just pause and flip it over to Malcolm to see if you want to clarify anything further there.
Sure. Okay, and I'll hold off on the second part for you to address there. I think you explained it well, that although a property, before Missing Middle came in, might have the R1A zone on it, and it retains even now the R1A zone, it's just additional regulations are now linked to that property that enable Missing Middle housing as well. I'll pass back to Lauren.
Sure, go ahead, Bob, if you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, and I guess I have a supplemental question to that is the Missing Middle housing bylaw really enables some significantly, I'm going to say, oversized buildings in the residential areas. What retaining our zoning but making it multifamily is there's the opportunity to have buildings that are multifamily units proportionally more balanced. And I go back to that area, that idea of nuance of, what works in many of the post-World War II bungalow areas of the city, that old 7.5 meter height was great. And now we're at a 1-to-1 floor space ratio. On many of these lots, you could build three unit buildings, a couple of 1,300 square foot multi-bedroom homes and some sort of a studio or single family. So it's back to this idea of nuance as opposed to, and I'm going to propose taking a sledgehammer to the city with up to 6 stories everywhere. So the Missing Middle, was a significant increase in building heights and in floor space ratios, or how much building can go on those sites at the 1 or 1-to-1 FSR. But we have a tool that might allow some neighborhoods to maintain some sort of fit balance with how they exist today, but it doesn't seem to be getting any discussion. And I think for many of us who live in residential areas, that's a concern.
Okay, thanks for that, Bob. Maybe this is a good time to address some of the other comments that are coming up in the chat around the potential impact of some of this redevelopment that you're talking about, Bob, on green spaces and community infrastructure. So rather than thinking sort of specifically, if you have a map in your head of Victoria of, this series of blocks might be appropriate for this thing and this series of blocks might be appropriate for this other thing. What we recognized when we began to study how we could unlock that land supply and make opportunities to really finally address this housing crisis in a meaningful way, we realized that opportunities don't exist cleanly in that kind of area, neighborhood, block pattern. They exist throughout Victoria and are often dispersed, and if designed well, can work well together. So that kind of comes back to that image that Malcolm had on the screen early in the presentation about how the diversity of housing on a block could evolve over time, recognizing that not all houses will redevelop all at once. And in fact, in our context here in Victoria, it's very unlikely that many houses will develop all at once, and extremely unlikely that an entire block would redevelop all at once. We have high land costs, we have interesting block patterns that make for a great city, but also make for that type of more greenfield development really basically impossible. So we will see this evolution happen over time. So what we want to do as a city is provide the opportunities wherever they can be realized and wherever they can meet these really high standards of good urban design. And so this comes to one of the questions that I saw in the chat about preserving that backyard green space where it exists today. And that is absolutely something that we identified. We know that in order to have a healthy urban forest, recognizing we are an urban community, we're going to have to figure out creative ways to maintain that forest, not just the trees that are here today, but the trees that we're going to need for decades and decades to come as the climate continues to change and we need to continue to adapt to it. And so providing that space in our public right-of-way is a huge part of that solution. And that kind of comes back to the discussion that we had about linear parkways before. But we also recognize that where a lot of that green space exists today is in people's backyards. And so when we create that opportunity everywhere and we want to hold people to these high standards of good urban design, one of the ways that we can do that is ensure that the buildings are oriented very close to the front line of the property. And so even though you will be taking over more of the green space in the back, as you look at the interior of that block perimeter, you can see that's what gives us our opportunity to preserve that green space. It also can become a social space, a shared social space over time, but at the very least, it has that opportunity to protect those trees. So the way that we do this is we create strong open sites space parameters and guidance in our zoning bylaw. And that's something that we've identified that we will do, including in coordination with our urban forest team to ensure there's space for healthy tree canopy coverage and good permeability in that back area. And then the other way we do that is through design guidelines. So if we're thinking about where a building works well at any scale, it's better for us to think less about the map, because we know that the opportunities in Victoria are so few and far between, and think more about our general urban design guidelines. So Malcolm also shared on his screen kind of a flash of some of those key features. Yeah, that's it. Thanks, Malcolm. Key features of those principles of good urban design that, as we kind of unlock this land supply and create these opportunities, we need to really strongly adhere to ensure that we're creating that good community. And all of these kind of principles, so we've got I think 10 principles are shown here on the screen at a very high level. They're all detailed out in a larger package of design guidelines that all of these developments that would need to adhere to as we move this work forward. So hopefully that covers of some of the questions in the chat and speaks to some of the comments that you made verbally as well, Bob. So as I was saying all of that, I saw a lot of questions starting to pop up here as well and comments. I might just take a minute to take a break, but Malcolm or others, if you've been following it, feel free to chime in to anything that's popped up. Okay, so I see a couple of last questions here in the chat about heritage and neighborhoods, and that's, I think definitely a big part of today's theme. So maybe I'll spend a few minutes addressing that before we close out here at 1:30. So heritage is absolutely a big part, I think, of Victoria's identity. As Kirk, in the chat here, it's been a big draw for tourism. So it's not just part of what we value as a community, but I think it's a big part of our economy too. And we absolutely understand that. And our heritage program has been really celebrated across BC. I think many other cities often look to ourselves and the heritage program at cities like New Westminster to see how they can preserve what is remaining of their built heritage today. Together with that, though, we've also heard over the years that Victoria hasn't done the best job of protecting, enhancing, or reflecting other forms of heritage. So we've done a really good job in a lot of areas of the city of protecting built heritage, particularly of sort of the colonial era. Kind of like the turn of the century type homes and commercial buildings and streetcar buildings that we see in a lot of the city. We've done a really good job of that in many areas. But we haven't done a great job always of reflecting more intangible heritage. So we've heard in recent planning processes that we haven't done a great job of protecting multicultural heritage across the city or reflecting multicultural heritage across the city. Indigenous heritage, I think we've heard we can do a much better job of reflecting those forms of heritage. or ecological heritage. We have this really beautiful, lovely history of a Garry Oak ecosystem and Camas Meadows across our region. And, as we grow, how can we reflect all of those things more? And so we are thinking about heritage as we go into this OCP update. And what we really want to hear from the community is what they value most so that we can integrate that into the program. Then from there, we have tools at our disposal to do that. So we can do more research and work to identify other heritage properties around the city. We can use tools around registration and designation. We can use our heritage conservation areas. All of these tools, though, are dependent on the actions of private property owners. So we cannot limit the redevelopment of a site that's not designated for heritage protection. Even in an HCA, if a site wants to redevelop, we have to allow that. And we have to allow now, based on recent provincial changes, the number of units that the province has required in all sort of traditional residential areas. What we can do is to guide the design of new development to be complementary to the heritage assets and reflect the heritage values that we've identified there. So what we need to hear in this OCP update through this engagement from you today, if you want to pop it in the chat, if you want to send us an email, and of course, please take the survey where we ask a question about this, is what are those values in our community today? What do we think is most important to protect? And that can help us to sort of set the foundation, develop the program, identify the right type of tool. I think I saw another question here. Oh, about the individuality of neighborhoods. And so this, I think, is a great question too. Victoria is a city made up of lots of small communities. And when we went out into this OCP work, we really recognized that we are facing some mega challenges. We are facing a housing crisis in a big way that we have a big responsibility to be a part of the solution to. And we're facing a climate crisis. And so while we cannot undermine the value of our community that happens across our neighborhoods in our unique local villages, we know we need to come together as that group of communities to create this one plan for a city to address these big challenges, that we can't kind of be in a siloed world and do that. That said, though, even though we have those big challenges to face together, that doesn't mean we need to undermine what makes Victoria great today. And so this is the role that our recent neighborhood planning has done. We've got lots of great plans on file for specifically the villages. We've got detailed, interesting plans that reflect the kind of unique identity of the villages across our city. And for public spaces in our neighborhoods to suit the kind of local community. We recognized when we went into this process, we did not have recent plans for all of those areas, that a lot of our villages have outdated plans, that we haven't thought about public space and connectivity at a local scale in some areas. And so that's why we just went through this place-based planning process for those areas of the city that are lacking kind of detailed planning. But we did that now, and together with what we have done over the recent years, we will be able to take those detailed directions forward and kind of help shape that and cement, I think, that really unique connected network of villages and neighborhoods throughout Victoria. And again, this is a great opportunity during this sort of community theme of the OCP update for you to share what you value about the local area in your community. And I would just very much encourage you to think about the fact that as a whole city, we do collectively have to come together and figure out how to address these major challenges. And so an idea of kind of keeping things exactly as they are, it's never really a great idea for cities. Cities will always evolve whether we like it or not. And so now's the chance to kind of think about what's most important to retain, how we do want to evolve, and how we can evolve together to keep that unique identity and still solve these major challenges. So I saw a few more comments, I think mostly, come up in the chat. And we have just 4 minutes left today in our session, I think. Is that right, Amy and Laura? Hopefully I haven't lost track of time here. Okay, wonderful. So with those last 4 minutes, I will happily maybe take one more question, or if anyone else in the team has identified a question in the chat that I may have missed and wants to chime in. Take a minute there. Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you all again. I think one last time for taking this hour and a half out of your day to be here with us and for providing so many great comments and questions in the chat space here. All of this will be sort of collected and digested as part of the entire engagement. But we're not done yet. So thanks for popping that up there, Malcolm. We do have another Let's Talk session where Malcolm will give the same presentation focused on community. And that's this Thursday from 5:30 to 7. So if you know anyone who couldn't make today's lunch session, please let them know that they're still welcome to register and join us for the evening session on Thursday. We also have one more big open house. This will be a really fun one. It'll be focused on climate. Again, this really important issue for our entire city. That will be outside at Central Park, right beside Crystal Pool on July 6th from 11 to 3. I understand that we're probably going to have some good sweet treats for hot weather. So please come on out and tell us your priorities around climate or anything else that we're discussing as part of the OCP. And then following that, we'll have 2 more Let's Talk sessions, again, related to the climate theme, another lunch and an evening one. So those will be July 16 and July 18, respectively. And the survey is still open. So if you haven't taken it yet, or if you know anyone who hasn't taken yet, please share widely and do take it yourselves. That is available at our project page at engaged.victoria.ca. And we will pop that link in the chat for good measure. So thanks all and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thanks, Laura.